Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, August 18th, 2021. And on this episode, I've got an introduction. There's a lot of information in this, but it really still is just scratching the surface. An introduction to the power to declare war under the Constitution, something delegated specifically to Congress and not the executive branch. I'm going to start out with some general observations on war from people like Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and John Jay. Then I'm going to go into a section talking about why they actually separated this power to declare war from wage war, made sure that Congress had that, looking at history, comparing with monarchies of the past. I'm also going to briefly talk about how they defined war, what they considered was actually a war, what needed to be declared then, and then what was considered a declaration. Now, it didn't have to be a certain set of magic words. You might be surprised to know that it didn't even have to say we are declaring war on such and such to count as a declaration of war. What was the historical practice? How did the founders understand that as well? And then if I have time, because there's so much, and I'm going to have to do a chapter setup for those of you who watch on YouTube, so you can break down each of these sections. But if there's time, I'm going to compare what was considered a constitutional declaration of war back in the day to a modern day AUMF. But first of all, before getting to all that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. There you're going to find all the archives of the show for over 3 years now. On individual episodes like this one, especially this one, I've got tons of references, links for you to read more, original documents so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Again, I'm just scratching the surface, and there's way more to be learned on this as well. You can also find all the different platforms we're on. We are on a bunch of live streaming video platforms. We have archive video platforms. And the reason that we have all of these different platforms is, first of all, not everyone wants to be on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch. And then also, if you do like being on one of those platforms, maybe someday all of a sudden we're just gone and you're wondering why. Well, you shouldn't. It's probably because we said something that they don't like, and therefore you're going to have to find us elsewhere, like Odyssey.com or Gab TV or Minds and Brighteon and BitChute and elsewhere. And of course, we have the podcast edition as well on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and elsewhere. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. Again, all that and more over at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And just another moment or so, I'm going to say hello to everyone out in the live chat, do a few shout outs to give people a little bit more time to get notifications to join us on this very important live stream. Hi to Tim Martin in Arizona, Richard Banks in Fredonia, Kansas, Patricia Dance, Marie W. from Iowa, Resin Nunn in Missouri, Floyd Looney in Texas, Tavis Whiting in Lee Summit, Missouri. Cool. High school American government teacher. Glad to have you here. Murray Ray, Marie M., Ravioli Squirrel, Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana, Shane Lackey in the coastal plains of Georgia. I appreciate you all spending some of your time. Guy Emmett Knapp and everyone else. I apologize if I miss anybody. I'll try to look at the questions a little bit later in the episode or later on today. But let's start this out, as I mentioned, with a few observations from some leading, well-known founding fathers and old revolutionaries, they're both, on the nature of war. You might be surprised, but to put it lightly, the founding generation, even though they engaged in a long, bloody war for independence, for secession, for freedom from Great Britain, they weren't big fans of war. Here's Benjamin Franklin, for example, merely 8 days after. He's the guy who signed the Treaty of Paris. Well, one of a few. He signed the Treaty of Paris, formally ending, it really ended in practice, the war with Great Britain. And he's the guy who signed it. 8 days after, he sends a letter to Josiah Quincy Sr., September 11th, never forget, 1783, and he put it this way: there never was a good war or a bad peace. Now, he didn't oppose the Revolutionary War, but he recognized that even for good motives, all wars had terrible, terrible outcomes. Here's James Madison, for example, in Political Observations, April of 1795. He says, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. Now, Madison was not a guy who shied away from war either, but he recognized the danger and the damage that it does. The most to be dreaded because, he says, it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. This was widely recognized, this type of stuff, this opposition to war seen as a great danger. And so therefore, when they created the system under the Constitution, they wanted to slow down the process. They intentionally wanted to slow down, to not hurry the country into war, but the exact opposite. Here's John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, in Federalist number 4. He says, "It is too true, however disgraceful it may be to human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it." Again, another reason why the founding generation under the Constitution, they wanted to create a process which would slow things down. There wouldn't be a rush to war. And we'll understand why and how they did that in just a bit. Nay, he said, absolute monarchs will often make war when their nations are to get nothing by it, but for the purposes and objects merely personal, such as thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts, ambition, or private compacts to aggrandize or support their particular families or partisans. So this is something that they dealt with. They were students of history. They lived through. They participated in. They knew how this stuff played out. And we even know that they recognized from their own glorious revolution, their war of independence, they had armies and debts and taxes, and it created significant problems in the years to come. Now, this comparison of war with a monarchy, they kind of associated the two together. Here's a reference to the great Montesquieu from James Bowdoin in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, February of 1788. He's quoting Baron Montesquieu, who observes that the spirit of monarchy is war and an enlargement of dominion. Peace, he noted, and moderation are the spirit of a republic. So a monarchy is centralized, consolidated control in the hands of just a single person or a handful of people. A republic dispersed that power, and a federal structure dispersed it even further. These are all tools to prevent what is a monarchy associated with war, enlargement of dominion, destruction of liberty, and the like. So what did they do? They wanted to make things different from the monarchies of the past and the present for them. Here's James Iredell, also one of the first Supreme Court justices who was appointed, nominated by George Washington. Here he is speaking in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention, July of 1788. He noted that the King of Great Britain is not only the commander-in-chief of the land and naval forces, but has power in time of war to raise fleets and armies. He also has authority to declare war. So they noticed in all these other countries, in the monarchies, the king not only had the power to be the commander-in-chief, which is similar to what we have under the president, and we'll see how that is actually referenced in just a bit in the Federalist Papers, but unlike what was set up under the Constitution, the monarch, the king, also had the power to declare war. He says, the power of declaring war by his own authority. So the president does not have that, said Iredell. He says the power of declaring war is expressly given to Congress. They went out of their way to make sure that the executive branch did not have this power. That is, he says, to the two branches of the legislature, the Senate, composed of representatives of the state legislatures, interesting, no longer the same, the House of Representatives, deputed by the people at large. That's James Iredell. And here in the Federalist Papers, even Alexander Hamilton made almost this same point in Federalist 69. This is March of 1788. He says, the president is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same with that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance, much inferior to it. So being the commander-in-chief, that was very similar to the king. He says, but the power of the British king also extends to declaring, and he used all caps here, declaring war, and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which, by the constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislature. So they specifically separated those two powers of declaring and waging war, which would, under a monarchy, was in the hands of a single person. And they wanted to separate that. Why? Well, James Madison explains here, and we've got a few other explanations as well. He says the Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, not just some recent history, but Madison was a student of history going all the way back to the ancients, and he recognized that all through history, all, not some, not most, but all government demonstrates this, that the executive, he said, is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone with it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature. So the question of whether or not the country was going to be involved in a war, changed from war to peace, and actually from peace to war, vice versa, both ways, was specifically considered and decided. They gave it, delegated that power to the legislature, to Congress. Here's James Madison again in Helvidius number 1 in 1793, explains why. Those who are to conduct a war cannot in the nature of things be proper or safe judges whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded. This is just recognizing that when one person has that power, you can't trust them to just use it only for the right reasons. In extreme situations, for emergencies, they may want to use it, as John Jay pointed out, just to aggrandize themselves or their supporters. So the fewer the people that have that type of power, the more likely it's going to be abused. Again, with almost everything, centralization of power leads to abuse and corruption. Here's James Wilson in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, I believe, December 11th, 1787, pointing out what I mentioned just before. They intentionally tried to slow things down. Some people have said to me over the years, well, if you have to wait for Congress to debate over something and declare war, you might get attacked and then you won't be able to do it fast enough. Well, they understood this. The founders weren't dumb. I mean, this is an assumption that they didn't know what they were doing. Instead, they intentionally went out of their way to slow the process down. And if it has to be done fast, then certainly, I mean, Congress has moved all kinds of stuff fast when they want to do really bad things. So they could do the right thing pretty quickly, too. Debate on something that's very important. Anyways, that's a side discussion. He says, again, this system will not hurry us into war. It is actually calculated to guard against it. And here he is again. He says, it will not be in the power of a single man or a single body of men to involve us in such distress. There was some debate over maybe just giving the power to the Senate. There was other debate where there was a couple of proposals from some of the smaller states to say that the Senate should have a 2/3 requirement before they could do it. So there was some back and forth on this, but they wanted to make sure that not only was it in the legislature, but it was going to be a balance between the interests of the states and the people at large, between the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now that kind of line has been blurred and pushed away, and it's all just kind of more of a popular vote type of thing, we can see how the process gets sped up once again. So James Wilson says they're trying to slow it down. Back to James Madison. Again, political observations, he writes, the separation of the power of declaring war from that of conducting it is wisely contrived to exclude the danger of it being declared for the sake of it being conducted. I think that's the best short explanation as to why they separated those powers. They recognized they were students of history. They lived under a monarchy. They studied monarchies of the entire world and through all of history, of all recorded history that they could find. And they recognized that one person with power or just a cabal of people with power would be more likely to declare the war, change things from peace to war, just for the sake of doing it. Could be for profit, could be for domination and control. Who knows? Now, how did they define war? Well, we know that founding era dictionaries, if you have to understand the legal meaning of anything in the Constitution, you first have to start out with dictionaries at the time, both legal dictionaries and lay dictionaries. There are plenty of them, but you also can't start using like Webster's dictionary from 1828 because they weren't debating the Constitution for ratification in 1828. And the Constitution is a legal document. Like any legal document, the words of that document mean what it meant at the moment it was given today. So how they understood it at the time, it's not possible for them to read an 1828 dictionary because they weren't time travelers. So you have to get something from the range of when they were debating this stuff. 1770s, 1780s. You can maybe push it into the early 1790s because you're talking about things like the Bill of Rights being ratified in 1791. Here, for example, war, and I don't think I have this on the right page. Oh, here we go. War. War, a general understanding of war from various dictionaries, legal and lay, and there's a lot of other sources on this as well, really meant hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. So is any type of hostilities. And we'll get to some examples of that in just a minute. A very typical definition here from Barlow's dictionary, Complete English Dictionary, 1772 to 73, is the exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. Here it is. I mean, you can't really probably read it here on the screen. Maybe if I zoom in a little bit. The exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. So just initiating violence, any kind. It doesn't have to be a large amount of violence. It could be a small amount of violence. These were all acts of war. Here from Thomas Sheridan's dictionary, almost the same thing. This is 1789. This is the Complete Dictionary of the English Language. This is a widely read dictionary, very common for people to have it. Almost the same definition. War, to the exercise of violence under sovereign command. The instruments of war. So this is exactly what they were talking about. Any type of violence. It didn't have to be a full-scale invasion. It could be the launch of a cannon. It could be the capture of a ship. It could be really anything that is considered a violent act initiated by a sovereign when the other side didn't want it. And you don't really find too many situations where people are like, hey, drop a few bombs on me. So we're taught today that only a full-scale invasion counts as war, but then they can just drop bombs on an outpost or a wedding party or a ship or maybe assassinate a general or something like that. We're told that none of these things count as war because they don't rise to the level. They're just one mini conflict, and therefore the executive branch can do that on his own choice because if it isn't war, then you don't have to declare war. So that actually flies in the face. It's a complete lie. It has nothing to do with how the founders understood war. So under the Constitution, a small raid, a small incursion, assassinations, even blockades, these are all acts of war and require a declaration. So how did they understand declare? Here from a great paper from, man, and I'm going to butcher this name, Krishna Prakash, who's one of the great originalist scholars out there. If you read papers, white papers on SSRN, Prakash has a lot of awesome stuff, especially on the war powers clauses. For example, here he writes, the Greeks and Romans were said to have formally declared war prior to the commencement of warfare. If you're going to understand what the founders understood, you have to look at the history that they looked at as well. He writes, they gave advanced warning to their enemy, presumably because they thought it was the honorable thing to do. So there was some kind of honor. We're going to let you know we're going to fight. And also because the warning might cause the other nation to sue for peace. So it was basically a pressure tool. It was an honor thing. And then on top of it, it was to pressure them to back down from whatever it was, whether it was a territorial dispute, maybe someone was captured, whatever it may be. But then Prakash points out that this only lasted so long. He says that European nations inherited and perpetuated this practice at least for a time. At some point, presumably during the early modern European era, European nations concluded that giving warning came at too high a cost. The element of surprise would be lost, and with it, the war as well. So they stopped saying, here's a document that tells you we're going to attack starting next week or the week after. Instead, they started using what was called informal declarations of war. Anything that changed the situation from peace to war was considered a declaration. And sometimes they would issue this formal document sometime later. In some situations, it would be months, if not maybe a year later. They would say, here's what's happened and here's why. It would be more of an explanation to people and talking about what their demands were. Here's James Wilson pointing out, in his famous Lectures on Law, he adopted the view that declare war encompassed the power to start war. So this is one of the leading supporters of ratification, James Wilson. Some might actually call him the real father of the Constitution rather than James Madison, but he also took this position. Anything that changes things from peace to war was a declaration of war. That's why Thomas Jefferson, in this letter to Congress, when he's describing the declare war powers, December 6, 1805, he said, Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. He didn't say Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of making an official statement about what the executive branch has done, and the executive branch notified Congress within 60 days. No, only Congress has the power to change the condition from peace to war. A declaration of war was that change. It could come in the form of a paper document that said, this is what we're going to do. It could come in the form of withdrawing from a treaty. It could come in many forms, which I'll get to in just a moment. Here, back to Prakash. Any decision to wage war, however expressed, was regarded as a declaration of war. Contrary to what some might imagine, there were no prescribed words or phrases that had to be uttered in order to declare war. You don't have to have a specific set of magic words to count. It's really just making it clear that the intent was that we have decided that we are going to fight. We're going to be in a conflict with so-and-so. Many words and actions, Prakash writes, looking nothing like a formal declaration of war, were declarations of war nonetheless. Indeed, it was far more common for nations in the 18th century to informally declare war. We can go back through history again and look at how they did this. The Romans, for example, they declared war by throwing blood, smeared iron-tipped spears into enemy territory. So they'd take a spear, dip it into iron, dip the spear into blood, and then launch it into enemy territory. You may have seen that in some movies dramatizing this. I know I have over the years, and I didn't realize what was going on, but that was the notice. Uh-oh, the Romans are pissed. When enemies were not adjacent, Prakash writes, the Romans designated a spot in the Roman Forum as enemy territory and threw the spear into that ground. Now, if you think about the communication of the time, it wasn't like that was being live streamed. They were doing it for their own audience, for their own people, for their own politicians. And the people in the country that they were declaring war against, if they were a little further away, they would have no idea until the Romans showed up. And showing up in force was clearly a declaration of war. In medieval times, the unfurling of flags and the sending of a bloody glove, this is throwing down the gauntlet, served as declaration. So you just throw down, send a bloody glove or rip down a flag. The Barbary nations declared war by cutting down another nation's flag. This insult was a traditional means of declaring war precisely because it signaled a decision to resort to warfare. So in different cultures, it would be different things. You have to understand what they mean. So if the Barbary would say, okay, we're cutting down a flag, you're like, oh, you guys are being so rude. No. That meant they were going to fight you. They were probably going to attack your ships. And if you weren't aware of what their culture was, you could get yourself into some serious problems. Prakash goes on, he says, in fact, by the 18th century, most wars were declared via some hostile action rather than by a formal declaration of war. A formal declaration of war might be issued years after an informal declaration, if at all. And here, from the early American days, you can look at George Washington in the 1750s. And Prakash puts it this way: well before the Constitution was even contemplated, Americans understood that to commence war was to declare it. So the general understanding from the people of the time and in their own experience, because, for example, George Washington was leading troops to attack the French in the 1750s. Now, there was already a declaration of war elsewhere, but even in that situation, Washington asked, hey, well, how do we intend to do a declaration of war against the people here in this theater? Well, the declaration of war was literally just to launch the attack. So this is, again, as Thomas Jefferson put it, A declaration of war is merely saying that the status is changing from peace to war. It can come in a formal announcement. It can come in a warning, like if you need the political pressure. Maybe you decide to change your mind if they back down. Whatever it may be, but it's a change from peace to war. In 1776, a delegate to the Continental Congress wrote that the Portuguese have declared war against us by seizing our vessels and ports. So that's an act of violence. So if the Portuguese sovereign says, go get this is an act of violence, so therefore that counted as a declaration of war. In 1785, when Algerians seized 2 American ships, John Jay, who was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and many other Americans regarded this as an official declaration of war. In each of these situations, the seizure was seen as a declaration because of what the seizure was thought to signal. At a minimum, the seizure of ships signaled a decision to fight a limited war. In 1774, John Adams proposed, now this didn't actually go anywhere, but he was actually far more aggressive about this. He proposed that should anyone be arrested in the colonies, in any colony, and then taken away to England to be tried, that should also be considered a declaration of war. And here, one more. In 1789, Ambassador Thomas Jefferson reported to Secretary John Jay that the English had withdrawn from a treaty with France requiring notification of naval armament. Apparently viewing the withdrawal as evidence of a design to wage war, the French regarded it as a declaration. So merely withdrawing from a treaty in certain circumstances could be seen as a declaration of war. And of course, because the founders didn't want this to be in the decision of one person like the monarchs, because they were most prone to war, they said all of these determinations, anything that would signal that the U.S. was going to go to war, was in the hands of Congress. However they did it. And so the TLDR, the short version, declare war means it's up to Congress, and only Congress, if the status between the United States and another country is going to change from a status of peace to a status of violence, aggression, whatever, hostilities. And against which country? End of story. There is no question on that. In fact, James Madison really hammered that home. This was in 1793 in one of his Helvidius letters. He put it this way: the executive has no right in any case, no situation at all, to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. This is solely in the hands of Congress. So let's take a quick look before I head out here, as I'm running out of time a little bit, at a modern day authorization to use military force and compare that with the requirements that Congress is the one to decide if it's going to change from peace to war and against whom. So an AUMF against Afghanistan, for example. Well, it's not even against, doesn't even mention Afghanistan, I don't believe. Let's take a look. This is 2001. Just checking. The word Afghanistan is not in here. Anyways, I shouldn't be surprised. Here, Section 2. This is Public Law 10740 in September of 2001 of the 107th Congress Joint Resolution. They claim this qualifies as a declaration of war, and it says specifically, the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force. Now, that starts out fine. They're saying it doesn't have to have magical words that says declare war. We are declaring war. But it has to be Congress making the decision if and against whom. So check out this next section. The President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001. Oh, so what's actually happening in practice here? What if the President decides that France planned, authorized, or aided in the terrorist attacks? Well, then that means the President has the ability, according to this, to change the status of peace to war with the country of France. It doesn't matter. It could be any country. It could be England. It could be Russia, China, whoever. And who knows what type of things that they may want to use to expand on this in the future. So what this is actually doing is Congress is abdicating its responsibility to be the one that changes the status of the country against another from peace to war and saying, President, you get to decide. And that in and of itself is exactly the total opposite of what the founders tried to set up under the Constitution. And we know why, because they did not want one person having this type of power. So not only is it just up to the president to determine which nations planned, authorized, committed, or aided terrorist attacks of 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. And although that they claim this actually fits authority under the Constitution, what they're saying is, we're not going to make this decision of whether or not we are going to be in a status of peace or war against anyone. We're just going to pass the buck and tell the president that the president has the authority to do this. Can you imagine if there was a power in the Constitution, which doesn't exist, for one branch to take power that was specifically and thoughtfully delegated to that branch and hand it off to another branch to say, you guys get to do this now? How would that play out? I mean, would the judiciary take cases or controversies and say, well, Congress can try these cases. Congress can hear these. Can the executive branch say, well, I don't really want to be the commander-in-chief this year. I'm going to pass the buck and have the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the United States, you're going to be the commander-in-chief. No, when the founders delegated something to a specific branch in the Constitution or withheld it from other branches, or usually it's both at the same time, they did it because that is the only branch that is authorized to do this. So here in this 2001 AUMF, when they're saying the president gets to make the determination who he thinks we're going to go to war against, and it's open-ended up to his decision, his or her decision in the future. We could look and as long as this doesn't get repealed, this is there forever in order to prevent future acts of international terrorism. This could be anyone and everyone across the entire globe, and it again is under the decision of one person, which is exactly what the founders sought to reject under the Constitution. Well, since I'm running a little bit longer than I hope to today, I will have to check through the comments a little bit later today. Please continue leaving questions or thoughts or your feedback in the comments, whether it's live or in the archive. I'll reply to as many as I can. Of course, if you want to help support the show, our membership program is $2 a month. Excuse me, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Smash the like, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. All that stuff helps trigger the algorithm of the platform and tells that platform to show the program to more people. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.